So my name is Sarah Johnson, and on behalf of the Wilderness Workshop, welcome to the 6th of 10 Naturalist Nights. These happen each week here in Carbondale at the 3rd Street Center, and on Thursday nights at 7 o'clock in Aspen at the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies, Hallam Lake site. And so you can keep coming. It's always so great to see repeating people each week, and it's also great if this is your first Naturalist Nights this winter. Welcome. We also have these recorded on GrassRoots TV so that if you, for some reason, can't come one week or saw something on the schedule that you missed already this winter, they're on our websites, on ACE's website as well as the Wilderness Workshop's websites, and GrassRoots makes those available also on their TV station throughout the week ahead. We also partner with the Roaring Fork Audubon each to make this series happen. This program is always free because of these amazing sponsors. Maybe some of you are in the room, and if so, we thank you sincerely. And if you visit any of these businesses or companies, please make sure to tell them an extra thank you. Tonight, our featured sponsor this evening is the Aspen Club, and they've gone out of their way to make a significant contribution to making this happen this year. So we also, to be accountable to our sponsors, we do ask that everybody sign in. That helps us with numbers. We don't share your information with anybody except us and ACES and Audubon. But so I'm going to pass around a clipboard, and if you haven't yet signed it this evening, please do so. And also this year, we are offering continuing education certificates for anybody who needs a certificate of continuing education. There's a special clipboard over here by the piano, and you can sign it, and then each week initial it, and then at the end of the series, I'll send everybody that's signed up a certificate so you can use those for continuing ed credits. The Roaring Fork School District has pre-approved these for teacher license recertification hours, which is great. And before I introduce this evening's speaker, I will just say that there's a whole bunch of chairs up here, and I just invite you all to take a seat because it's easier that way. And there's also some seats in here in the middle, and if folks maybe scoot in and let people sit on the ends, that would be helpful. Because there are no more chairs. I've put them all out. So if you can scoot in and make seats available, that'd be great. Next week, we have another engaging, awesome presentation. Dr. George Whittemeyer, he's the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology. He's a professor with the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at CSU in Fort Collins. And his talk will be all about energy development's impacts on wildlife, lessons learned for the next energy boom. And his research was conducted out that direction, out in western Garfield County and in the Rowan Plateau area. So it's very pertinent to our work at the Wilderness Workshop and our community here in the Roaring Fork Valley. So without further ado, tonight we have two researchers from the Front Range. One is Sarah Reed. Sarah Reed, stand up. And one is Sarah Thomas. And I'm Sarah Johnson. Yay. So Sarah Reed, on my left here, is an associate conservation scientist with the North America program of the Wildlife Conservation Society and an affiliate faculty member in the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at Colorado State University. Her research investigates how land development and human activities affect wildlife and biodiversity, and she works with communities and government agencies to apply ecological science to inform conservation planning and land use policy. She currently serves as the Vice President for Programs of the Society of Conservation Biology and co-leads the Conservation Development Working Group at the School of Global Environmental Sustainability. And she also teaches some graduate level courses. Dr. Sarah Thomas, on my farther left, is a research affiliate at the University of Colorado Boulder and is principal of Sarah Thomas Consulting, LLC. Her work over the past 15 years has focused on the social, political, and policy drivers of land use change, particularly in the U.S., Western United States, and on strategies to ensure healthy local communities and environments. She has taught undergraduate courses on environmental policy at the University of California, Berkeley, and at the University of Colorado Boulder. She currently is a board member for the Wildlands Restoration Volunteers, and she, along with her husband and 2 kids, live in Boulder as well. So thank you so much for coming all the way over, and we'll turn the show over to them, and we'll have lots of questions later in the evening. Oh, please, yeah, let's do that. place under slideshow. And then view.
And then just press space.
That's it. And I'll turn the lights off.
Okay. Sweet. Well, thank you so much for having Dr. Reed and I here tonight. It's really a pleasure to be here. And we're going to be talking about balancing outdoor recreation with wildlife conservation. So to start out, we want to start with the disclaimer that we understand that this is a really complicated tale, and that we really understand it from both sides. Both Sarah Reed and I were born and grew up in Colorado. We spent our lives recreating and enjoying the public lands, and so and in fact, we started talking about this issue of the trade-offs between conservation and recreation when we were in graduate school and we were trail running with her dog, pictured here, Rufus, off leash. So we understand that it's a complicated tale. We understand that it's a sensitive topic. And so what we're trying to do tonight is just to have an open, respectful conversation. The other note that we would make is that it's a complicated tale, but in general, when we've given these talks, it's to audiences that may not even really be aware that there are some potential trade-offs between recreation and conservation. And so it's clear from these rash of recent newspaper articles that citizens up and down the Roaring Fork Valley are well aware of it. So we are going to try to keep our comments somewhat shorter maybe than normal so we can allow for a lot of questions and discussions. So I'm going to start tonight by giving you a little bit of information about the policy context and how we ended up with these twin goals of outdoor recreation and conservation. Sarah Reed then is going to talk about some of the science of what we know and what we don't know, and then I will come back to talk about some of the management challenges that are related to this, and then what are some recommendations about how we might deal with it. So I'm going to turn our attention now to Jefferson County. And I know that people in the Roaring Fork Valley don't necessarily like to look to the Front Range for any sort of model or example or inspiration, but maybe you'll bear with me for a bit because I think that there's a lesson here. So in 2011, Jefferson County Open Space did a survey of their citizens in which they asked a number of questions related to their goals and hopes for open space. And as you can see, that wildlife, when looking at one of the benefits of open space, was ranked nearly as high as outdoor recreation. And at the same time, when citizens were asked about the desired emphasis for the open space, almost half of them said they wanted this equal balance between outdoor recreation and between conservation. And I think that Jefferson County makes kind of 2 points with this, which is that people want they want both outdoor recreation and conservation, and there's this kind of perception that you can have them both successfully in the same place. And it's no surprise that citizens might think this is the case because outdoor recreation and conservation are often tied up in the mandate and the mission of many open space agencies, as it is with Jefferson County. And in fact, Jefferson County really is an illustrative and kind of representative example of what is going on kind of writ large on American public lands. And that's two things. One is that recreation is widely permitted. In US public lands, 99.3% permit recreation access. And then the second point here is that most of these public lands also have dual mandates. So at the same time that they're permitting recreation, they're also trying to conserve natural resources and wildlife, as you can see here written in the Organic Act, which established the National Park Service. So the question is, how did we get here? How did we get to the situation where we have recreation and conservation so closely linked together? And why does it matter? So to kind of answer this question, we need to go back a little bit in time to the 1950s and the 1960s, when recreation became a major driver for open space protection. I mean, it's true that with the National Park Service and with state parks, recreation had been a driver for conserving and protecting some of those lands. But it wasn't until the 1950s and 1960s that you start to see recreation as a real dominant use of some of these public lands, and particularly in municipal areas where you start to see it as a driver for open space protection. And the reason for this is kind of threefold of what was going on in the 1950s and the 1960s. And so the first is that just the demand was exploding after World War II. There was this kind of pent-up frustration. Now people have leisure time, they have income, there's not gas rationing. And so people start going outside following World War II in really record numbers. But at the same time that you're getting this increasing demand, you're starting to get a decrease in supply, particularly in suburban and kind of what we now would refer to as ex-urban areas, because there was rapid suburbanization going on in the 1950s and the 1960s. And in fact, 1960s, kind of one of the leading, I would say maybe the top environmental issue that was on people's mind was land use and sprawl. So at the same time, you've got this demand, you've got this concern that there's not enough supply, and kind of underneath all of that is this kind of national ethos that we have of the importance of outdoor endeavors for kind of our national old school frontier spirit. So what happens then is that during this time period that recreation and conservation become tied into into a lot of key pieces of national laws and funding around conservation. So some of the key bills and legislation that came out of this period, like the Wilderness Act, the National Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, they were driven with this recreation component. And at the same time, some of the major funding sources that we still have for new land acquisitions, namely the Land and Water Conservation Fund, was created with recreation in mind. So in some ways, this is a really positive story, right? I mean, you've got people recreating, that's wonderful for people's mental health, for their physical health, it's really good for economic reasons, and Americans were doing a really good job of trying to protect these lands for future human uses. The kind of the catch or the complication, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, is that there wasn't a lot of thought really about whether or not there were inconsistencies between recreation and conservation. Because at the time, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One of them was at the time, it was just really before the ecological movement had really started to take hold. So there just wasn't as much awareness about natural resources, ecosystems, and wildlife. And in addition, it is particularly in the 1950s, the dominant concern about public lands was around kind of commercial extraction and water development, like Echo Park pictured here. So it just wasn't really on the radar of people who were working to designate new lands and to acquire new lands. And to the extent that they were thinking about recreation as some sort of potential, issue, it was more in terms of the scenic and recreation values. Well, so why does this all matter? Why does this little history lesson matter? I mean, the first thing is that our public lands are the major tool for ecological protection that we have. So scientists and conservationists are looking to public lands to protect biodiversity and natural resources. And so these tools, the Wilderness Act, et cetera, these lands that have been acquired, they're what conservationists and scientists are looking to protect biodiversity. But at the same time, the conservation success, whether or not that works, is really rests on this assumption that this recreation access and species protection are compatible goals. And that's an assumption that's just been largely untested to date by conservation science. And then the final reason is that recreation rates are just growing, both in terms of total numbers of people who are participating in recreation as well as participation rates. So given all of these factors, it's worth better understanding the potential trade-offs between the goals of recreation access and biodiversity protection in public lands. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Reed, who's going to talk about what we know and what we don't know about the science.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for coming out tonight. This is a great turnout. So as Dr. Thomas mentioned, I'm here to kind of turn the story to talking about what we know about that trade-off of blending the missions of recreation and conservation in our protected lands, in particular thinking in terms of the effects of human recreation activity on wildlife. I'm then going to talk about what we don't know, and in particular highlight for you what I think are some important priorities for future research, in particular that is targeted at informing those land protection, designation, and management decisions that are being made every day. And then finally, I want to briefly kind of talk about what we're doing to fill those gaps and highlight a handful of current research projects that are going on in my group to attempt to address some of those gaps in our knowledge. So what do we know about the effects of recreation on wildlife? So it's clear when we look at the increase in research activity on this topic. This is a graph that's showing the increase in the number of published scientific studies on the topic of recreation and wildlife since 1980. There's clearly an increasing interest and increasing evidence that we can rely on. And I should mention that all of the data that I'm going to present in the first portion of my presentation comes from my Ph.D. student, Courtney Larson, whom I co-advise with Kevin Crooks at Colorado State University. And she conducted a global systematic literature review of all of the published research on the effects of all types of what we call quiet, non-consumptive recreation activities, things like hiking, biking, equestrian, wildlife viewing, on all types of animal species everywhere in the world. And so this really shows the temporal pattern of those studies that she collected, the increasing number of published studies over time. So it's clearly increasing, but I would encourage you to look at the numbers on the y-axis over on the left, and you'll see that sort of a peak year for publishing on this topic was 25 studies. And that's not really very many when, again, you think about the fact that we're talking about all kinds of recreation activities on all types of animal species anywhere in the world. And in fact, when you look at kind of the research and publication trends on this topic relative to other major threats to wildlife, such as urbanization or climate change, you can see that our research activity on this topic, and so our understanding of those effects, is still relatively low. So what are we finding when we look at the content of these studies? So we've asked a variety of questions, like where is the research being conducted, what species are being studied, and what are they finding? And when we look at the geographic distribution of these studies, we see that the vast majority of them are being conducted in more developed countries in North America, in Europe, and in Oceania, which in some ways is good news for us, because that means there's more information that's more likely to be relevant to the places where we live. It's less good news for the rest of the world, where there's a lot of evidence showing that recreational visitation to protected lands is increasing most rapidly in less developed regions of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. When we look at what species are being studied in these research projects, we find a pattern that's relatively consistent across all of wildlife research, that the vast majority of the research is focused on mammal and bird species, much less on other taxonomic groups. There's a relatively healthy focus on invertebrates that comes mostly from studies of the effects of recreational scuba diving on corals. But we know very, very little about the effects of recreation on amphibians, on fish, and on reptiles. I'll also mention that of these species, the vast majority of them are common species that are not threatened by other types of human activities. So very few researchers are also focusing on recreation as a potential stressor for species that are listed as vulnerable, as threatened, or as an endangered species. So in addition to asking where people are doing their work, what species they're looking at, Courtney asked what types of effects of recreation, or what types of effects on wildlife of recreation are being studied and are being detected. And I've broadly grouped these into three main groups, into effects on species that occur at the community level, into effects that occur at the population level, and effects that occur at the individual level. And I want to just briefly provide you an example of each of those different types of effects. So community level effects of recreation on wildlife can occur when recreation activity leads to changes in the composition of a species community, so which species are there, in the diversity of a species community, so the total number, how many species are there. And this typically occurs as sensitive species decline or disappear from the community and human-adapted species increase. So the example I've highlighted here comes from my own research in coastal Northern California, where we found that simply allowing public access for recreation to protected lands changed the composition of the carnivore community. In sites that were open to access, we found more non-native carnivore species. In sites that were closed to access, we found more native species. So population level effects. Population level effects of recreation on wildlife typically occur when a population's vital rates, its rates of reproduction or rates of survival, are affected by recreation activity, leading to changes and typically declines in the abundance, the density, or the distribution of a sensitive species. So the example I've highlighted here comes from southern England, where researchers demonstrated that the density of woodlarks declined with increasing levels of recreation disturbance, which they measured as basically the density of people visiting a recreation area over time. Finally, recreation can have individual level effects or effects on individual animals. So typically this occurs when disturbance from recreation results in observable physical effects on an animal, for example, increased stress levels, or behavioral effects, for example, flushing or changing in foraging behaviors, and that occurs to individual animals. And the example I highlighted here comes from Switzerland, where a research group looked at the effect of flushing by recreational skiers and snowboarders on stress levels in black grouse. And they did this in both experimental and observational studies. So in that top panel, they actually went out and intentionally flushed the black grouse, simulating those recreation activities, and measured their stress levels before and afterward, and unsurprisingly, they were higher afterward. They also did so in an observational manner, where they looked at areas that had no recreation activity and that had moderate and high levels of regular skiing and snowboarding activity. And they saw the same thing, that those grouse that were living in those areas that were regularly flushed by those recreationists just had chronically higher stress levels, which can then have consequences for the physical health, reproductive ability, and survival of those animals. So back to our review. So on the left, we're looking at the proportion of the studies that were included in our review that looked at each of those different kinds of effects of recreation activity on animals. And on the right-hand column, we're looking at the proportion of those studies that observed a statistically significant effect of that recreation activity on that animal species. And overall, across the board, in Courtney's review, 93% of the published studies observed at least one statistically significant effect on wildlife, and those effects were typically negative. Negative effects might include things like a decrease in species diversity, in population abundance, or in the survival rate of a species. But you can see that the research effort is not uniform across these different kinds of effects, and neither is what the researchers are finding. So I just want to highlight a couple things for you. One is that by far the greatest proportion of these studies were focused on behavioral effects to individual animals and on effects on population abundance. I would highlight behavioral effects in particular because because it's quite difficult in many cases to clearly demonstrate that a behavioral effect is definitely negative for an individual animal or for a population as a whole. And in addition, kind of when we look at these two things that researchers have concentrated on the most, behavioral effects and abundance effects, we see that those studies are actually detecting effects on those particular features less frequently than other studies. For example, than studies that have looked at effects of recreation on species diversity or on species survival, which have observed a statistically significant effect and typically negative effect 2/3 or more of the time. So this suggests one place where we might focus more of our future research effort to understand better whether or not that pattern holds. One of the other reasons that we did this review is we were interested in understanding whether there were particular groups of species that were more likely to be sensitive to disturbance by recreation. And what we can see is that when we look at kind of the broadest taxonomic level, we don't really see a clear pattern. What I can tell you without going into a ton of detail is that when you go to finer taxonomic levels, when we have enough information about more specific groups of species, there are some that emerge with a greater evidence of negative effects of recreation. Those include things like shorebirds, like ungulate species, like deer and elk, sharks and rays, and corals. Finally, and I know there's a lot going on in this slide, so I'll walk you through it. We were interested in whether there was greater evidence for effects of different types of recreation activities. So I've listed all those recreation activities down the left. You don't have to read those words. You just have to be able to see the colors. Because what I've done is I've grouped for you at the top various aquatic recreation activities in blue. In the middle, in green, are what I would call summer season terrestrial recreation activities. And at the bottom in red are snow-based activities. And again, on the left, we're looking at the proportion, the percent of articles or the proportion of research effort that has investigated these different types of recreation activities. On the right are the proportion of those studies that detected a significant effect on wildlife. And there's a lot going on, but I want to highlight a couple of surprising patterns in these results. One is that, counter to many people's intuition and public perception, we observed statistically significant effects of motorized recreation less frequently than effects of non-motorized recreation. Now, there's two important caveats on that result, right? One is that very, very few of these studies were directly comparing one type of recreation activity to another, which is what you really need to do in order to say whether or not one has a greater impact for a particular species. This is also not to say that motorized recreation activities don't have effects on wildlife. There's plenty of evidence for other ecological properties and processes, for example, soil compaction and erosion, that there are negative effects. And this review in no way assessed, for example, the spatial distribution of effect, the magnitude of which may be greater for motorized activities which allow people to travel further. But what I can say is that in terms of the body of published evidence, fewer of the studies of motorized recreation showed a statistically significant effect on wildlife. The other result I will highlight for you of particular interest probably to this region is that studies of snow-based activities detected significant effects on wildlife more frequently than studies of aquatic activities or studies of summer season terrestrial activities. Also perhaps a source of concern, but here my caveat is to point you to the left-hand figure, and you'll see that it represents, studies of snow-based activities represent a very, very small proportion of the overall research effort in this topic. And so what this result suggests to me is we need to spend more time understanding how snow-based activities may or may not be impacting species during sensitive winter seasons or in sensitive alpine environments. So I would argue that review tells us that there's still actually a lot that we need to know about the effects of recreation on wildlife. I think that what we do know can give us cause for concern, but in particular, I think we can use that information to highlight kind of where we might spend our research effort in the future to best understand kind of where those trade-offs between recreation and conservation are most likely to occur, and in particular, what we can do to minimize or mitigate those impacts so that both objectives can be achieved for our protected lands. So, what we know. So what I told you is that most studies to date have focused on bird or mammal species. But what we really need to know is which species are most sensitive to disturbance by recreation and under what circumstances. And in particular, this points to a need to fill those gaps for those much less studied groups of species, in particular amphibians, fish, and reptiles. What we know is that a majority, more than half of the studies that we reviewed, focused on individual level effects of recreation on individual animals. and the majority of those were focused on behavioral effects. And as I mentioned before, detecting a behavioral effect does not necessarily mean that something negative is happening for that species at the population or the community level. Similarly, failing to detect a behavioral effect does not mean that there's nothing going on at the population or community level. But those are the levels at which we typically manage species, and so I would argue that we need to invest more of our resources towards understanding the consequences of recreation activity for species populations and communities. Third, the greatest proportion of the studies we found, a quarter of them, focused on hiking. Hiking is a very common recreation activity, so at some level, perhaps that's appropriate. It's one of the most dispersed across the landscape. It's the one in which the most people participate in. But the question that we get most often when we present this research is, how do different recreation activities impact species differently? And again, like I said, very, very few of the studies that have been done to date have focused on the effects of different recreation activities at the same time, in the same place, and on the same species, which is what you really need to do in order to be able to say something about relative levels of impact. Fourth, most of the studies we looked at, 80%, measured recreation as a categorical variable. And what I mean there is they compared recreation areas that were open or closed to public access, or that had relatively low or relatively high levels of recreation activity without actually counting people. And this is in part because very few protected areas collect even the most basic information on visitation patterns: how many visitors enter in a day, where they go during their visit, when they visit, what sorts of activities that they engage in. But ultimately, that's the sort of information that we need to be able to relate those visitation patterns to species effect and understand what are the thresholds of disturbance by recreation in terms of the number of visitors, in terms of their spatial distribution, in terms of the timing of their visits, and be able to relate those thresholds back to management objectives. Finally, relatively few, only about a third of the studies we reviewed, were conducted in an experimental design or explicitly tested management alternatives. But again, these are the kinds of studies I would argue that we most need in order to understand what our options are for managing possible negative effects of recreation, and also understanding if those management practices that are already implemented are actually effective at minimizing or mitigating those impacts. So in closing, I don't want to kind of leave you on that note that there's a lot we need to do. I want to illustrate for you some of the ways in which we're doing it and some of the research that my group is doing to try to help fill those gaps. The first example comes from the Adirondack Park in upstate New York. This is our largest protected area in the lower 48. And in Adirondack Park, with some of my colleagues at the Wildlife Conservation Society, we're investigating the effects of both aquatic and terrestrial recreation activity on a variety of different species groups that they've studied for the past 15 years. And some of our preliminary research in that landscape indicates that the intensity of recreation activity is strongly and negatively correlated with the occupancy of several sensitive boreal bird species, such as the gray jay. And so a couple of the gaps that we're really trying to fill with that study are, first of all, a better understanding of dispersed aquatic recreation activity and its effects in that landscape, which is a relatively, an area that's been relatively little studied. And then another thing that we're doing is developing a system to engage citizen scientists in helping us to do this research in that system, and actually involving the recreational users themselves in collecting data, not only about their own activity patterns, but also the species that we're monitoring. Secondly, closer to home in Boulder County, Colorado, we started a pilot study in collaboration with Boulder County and the city of Boulder to look at the effects of recreation activity on a couple of species of concern, not pictured here. I gave you a nice picture of a bobcat, but we're working on Abert squirrels and dusky grouse there. And in particular, those managing agencies were interested in trying to address that gap in our understanding of the effects of different kinds of recreation activity, most notably the difference between hiking and mountain biking, and the differences that we observed in areas that had different approaches to managing dogs, off-leash, on-leash, or where humans were permitted and dogs were excluded. And what I can tell you is that although we're sort of still working through the data analysis for the species responses, those permitted uses, whether or not bikes are allowed, whether or not dogs are allowed, absolutely influence the patterns of use by humans. And so even if those permitted uses are not the factor that impacts species, they could still have an indirect effect on wildlife in the sense that they're largely determining where people are going in that landscape and in what numbers. Third, in San Diego County, California, we've been working for several years on this topic in collaboration with the state of California, trying to understand the effects of recreation within the Natural Community Conservation Planning Reserve System, which is a mouthful, but it's basically a reserve system that was designated as part of one of the first habitat conservation plans in the country under the Endangered Species Act to provide habitat and to monitor the populations of a large number of state and federal threatened and endangered species. And our goal in that study was first to help them fill that gap in their understanding of visitation patterns. So visitation wasn't monitored at all within this reserve system where the vast, vast majority of the reserves are open to the public. So we designed a system for them to monitor their visitation at the reserve level. We also did a spatial model to help them understand what characteristics of the site or what factors in the landscape were influencing how many people went to one reserve versus another. And finally, now we're getting to do the fun part, which is to relate those visitation patterns to wildlife detections. And in particular, in that system, it was a priority to fill the gap in our understanding about the effects of recreation on reptile species, for which there are many sensitive, threatened, and endangered species in coastal Southern California. Lastly, we have a new project in collaboration with the Sonoma Land Trust in Sonoma County in Northern California. And this is kind of an interesting project because the Land Trust is particularly interested in developing management guidelines for how to manage for recreation access in properties that they own, manage, or influence that were conserved primarily for providing wildlife habitat connectivity. So they're trying to understand kind of how to balance those objectives inside a critical linkage in the southern portion of the county. And one of the things that's most exciting about this project is that it gives us an opportunity in the next year or so to convene biological experts on the effects of human disturbance on wildlife and try to generate a more general set of recommendations for how to manage conserved lands to balance the objectives of recreation and conservation and share that information with the larger conservation community. So that kind of is a great transition point to bring Dr. Thomas back up here. And she's going to close by talking about kind of perspectives on this issue from the land management community, and also some of the recommendations that we've generated from our years of working together on this topic for sort of what to do now while we wait for all this science to catch up.
Great. So Sarah talked a lot about some of the science, what we know and what we don't know. But the reality is that the land managers and the community are kind of grappling with these issues in the interim. And so as a part of a fellowship I did at CU Boulder, I did interviews with a number of land managers, municipal, state, federal, about the challenges they experience in trying to manage between outdoor recreation access and between conservation. Because they're in many ways the ones at the front lines of dealing with these issues, obviously besides the wildlife. And what they pointed to, what came out of these interviews, were kind of 5 major challenges that they were experiencing. And this was across the board from local open space managers like Boulder County, Parks and Rec, and then as well as up to federal agencies like the US Forest Service. And the first one, the dominant one, was a limited awareness about recreation's impact on the part of the public. We did not gauge, I should put in the caveat, we did not survey the public to assess their level their levels of awareness. We talked to the land managers about their perception. And what we heard from them is that uniformly they saw the conflicts in their day-to-day work that they were doing on the land, but there was a very strong consensus, nearly 72%, that said that they didn't think the public saw it. As one land manager said, people don't see, and I quote, "people don't see the impacts either due to ignorance or a lack of baseline information," end quote. And so without this public awareness, that's a real problem for land managers because it makes effective management difficult. As one land manager explained, even though we have these regulations, people don't understand why they're in place, so they ignore them. And there were 4 reasons that surfaced as the main ones why land managers think that the public isn't as aware of these issues as they should. And I should say this is maybe less true, kind of given the publicity I talked about at the beginning in the Roaring Fork Valley. We were talking more generally across the West. But so the first one is what I've dubbed the visibility factor. And that's just the reality that quiet, particularly non-motorized recreation, those effects are not going to be visible to an untrained eye as, for instance, logging or energy extraction on public lands. And so it's just not as visible. The second and closely related to that is the scale factor, which is that an individual mountain biker, for a second to pick on them. I love mountain biking, but they have one experience of flushing a deer, for instance, and that's their only experience. But what they don't see is there are 300 people that come by on that same trail and have that effect. So they're not seeing the sum total of all these recreation uses. They just have their own particular experience to go from. The third is what I've termed, from a land manager, the finger pointing factor, which is that outdoor recreationists tend to consider other recreation activities as the main source of ecological damage. So whether it's motorized recreation and you're a non-motorized, if you're a hiker and it's that mountain biker, whatever it is, as one land manager explained, recreationists tend to, quote, overestimate others' impacts and underestimate their own. And then the final, and I think this is really important, is the what I've called the bigger fish to fry factor. And that is when you look at all of the other uses, particularly of public lands. This is not true on the municipal level, but if you look at energy extraction, if you look at hard rock mining, for instance, non-motorized recreation in comparison, seems very benign. And so land managers think that there's a tendency then for the public to just not pay a lot of attention because it seems so small compared to other things that are going on. The second major challenge that they face was just the recreation demand and diversification. So we already talked about how recreation rates are growing significantly, but perhaps more importantly is that what recreation is changing. And so we're not just talking about hiking, we're not just talking about mountain biking, we're talking about all these new types of activities, from Burning Man to heli skiing to pack rafting to supping to geocaching, you name it. There are all these activities that weren't really in play, again, back when some of these conservation tools were put into place. So what recreation is changing and when it's happening is also changing. So you're starting to see, like the Leadville 100, races, these kind of endurance events that are happening overnight, which is basically, Dr. Reed can confirm this, but it's basically unstudied in terms of how does the timing of these recreation activities, how might those affect wildlife? And for land managers, what that means is that they're often in a reactive mode in trying to plan for and manage these recreation activities because new ones are coming up, they're new access points, and so they're a little bit caught on the back of their feet. A third one that they pointed to was public resistance to restrictions. And so as one land manager said, they expect a lot of public interest in scrutiny in decisions they make, particularly that's going to restrict access temporally or spatially. And so that they have a tendency to, quote, "We often wait until we absolutely have to restrict access to a place because constituents will spend considerable time in appealing the decision." And so so that continues to be a challenge, as well as managing the tension between conservation and recreation, that land managers aren't really going to solve those tensions. They're just trying to manage them. A fourth significant problem, as Sarah Reed described in a lot of detail, is the just limited ecological data. That for most public agencies that are not as well funded as perhaps in this area, they just don't have the funding or the baseline information to be able to make decisions about what's happening on the land. And this lack of data can be really important in terms of making it harder for public agencies to determine some of these management decisions and then to defend them to the public. So if they don't have the data, they're not willing to restrict it, and that becomes a problem for the resource. As one land manager said, it's easy to give people what they want. It's harder to speak for the natural resources. And then again, this point about financial resources, even though recreation is a growing use of lands across the board, the amount of funding that's attributed, particularly for federal agencies, for recreation management is very, very small. And so there's just not either the kind of financial resources or the human capacity to be really able to assess these issues in the way that they need to be. And it may be, we'll see that over the next 4 years that funding continues to be an issue. So, a little bit of a dire picture, but there are some things that the management community and individuals can do as we wait for more ecological information. And so we have several management recommendations that we're going to share now. So the first is, a key decision that land managers and a community make is whether or not to allow public access in the first place. That's the most important consideration that they make. Land managers note across the board that once you've opened an area, it's really, really hard to close it. So in new acquisitions, making that initial consideration, should it be open, is going to be really critical. And because of that, we recommend that there's a decision process that explicitly assesses the value of an individual site, both for its relative recreation benefits and for its conservation benefits, so that there's a deliberate process that management agencies go through. The second is that successfully mitigating recreation impacts depends on planning and enforcement. And so we recommend that management agencies actually look at access points, they look at potential changing demographics, and plan for the way that they are going to mitigate potential recreation impacts over time. But a key here is enforcement. Right? As we all know, a plan is only as good as its implementation and how well it's enforced. And so making sure that that once a policy is in place or a plan is in place, that's actually enforced. And then finally, and then the second point is, looking at these changing demographics to anticipate changes in use over time to the extent that that's possible given the diversification of recreation. And then finally, we think there's a value in this consideration of recreation versus conservation, to not just look at a reserve level, but to look more broadly across a network of reserves. Because it may be that there's some specific areas that have really high recreation benefit, for instance, or another reserve that's really important for a particular sensitive species. And so not just limiting the viewpoint to the reserve, but starting to look at more of a landscape level and doing that kind of planning. And there's some very good examples of groups in California that are doing that work. But it's not just the community. There's us as individuals that we can do, which seem a little bit like common sense, but they can really make a difference. So staying on existing trails, respecting seasonal closures, minimizing your noise on the trail, not approaching wildlife, and reducing the speeds of motorized vehicles. But at the end of the day, I think as individuals, the best thing that we can do if we're concerned about these issues is to support our management agencies. So to support them financially, to support them politically, and in terms of our behavior. So thanks so much. Dr. Reed and I are happy to stay and answer some questions.
So, questions. Who's ready?
Enjoyed the Larson paper. One of the distinctions that Colin Beal made a couple years ago was the distinction between effect on an animal and impact. And you use those words interchangeably, which I think is an error. There was a wintertime study in Colorado, just to cite one, in which they looked at the approach of hikers to deer or elk versus the approach of snowmobiles. And they found, as you have said, that the animals stayed away longer, certainly from the hiker than from the snowmobile. Frans de Waal has a wonderful book called "Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are?" And I think it would be a dumb deer who would instantly decide that the hiker was not a hunter. So they move away, and that seems smart. The wintertime death rate among the animals that moved away was 9 to 14%. The overall wintertime death rate in the total population in that area was 26%. So the animals that moved, I'm not going to claim that, but clearly there's a whole issue in these studies about impact versus effect. And I think it's hard, we need data, we need better studies, we need better information. That's all I really had to, I'd like you to comment on that.
Okay. Sure. I mean, I can't comment on that individual study because I don't know them all, off the top of my head. What I can say, and you're right, like what we mean to characterize here are effects, and that we only want to characterize them as negative effects, which is typically how people interpret impact when that's what was specifically detected. I can say, I guess, two things about your comment. One is that there is a lot of thinking in those studies that have compared kind of motorized activities to non-motorized activities, the very few that exist, that there is a couple of reasons why they might detect a stronger effect of the non-motorized activity, be it hiking or a snow-based activity, because the individuals are typically quieter and have a better likelihood of sneaking up and surprising the animal, and because the human form is recognizable to the animal as a threat in the way, same way that a bike or a vehicle might not be. The other piece of your comment I can address is there are absolutely individual studies that show conflicting results, and that's kind of the way of science across the board. And what we were trying to do with this review is we saw that this didn't exist, and we got these questions all the time when we spoke about our individual studies. So we just wanted to bring the full body of evidence together. And I think that there are some patterns in that evidence that at least tell us that we should be thinking about this issue and that we should be working in specific ways to fill certain gaps in the future to make sure that we have the information that we need to support the decisions we need to make.
Industry as a friend or a foe in this context?
I'm going to give that one to you.
I see them as a strong potential ally. Potential. I mean, I think that there is, as I said at the beginning, recreation has been an important catalyst for conservation, and I think that it will continue to be. And there are many benefits of outdoor recreation. I think that, and I'd like to think that, for most recreationists, not all, but for most recreationists, there is a concern and a commitment to the resources. And so that part of what's needed is just more awareness about our individual actions. Whether the outdoor industry and kind of the related advocacy groups get there, it's a little bit tough to tell. I mean, in some ways I'm sympathetic. They are trying to make a case for public lands, trying to show the economic benefits, which are very real for outdoor recreation, for Western communities and for small rural economies. And these days, kind of protecting our public lands is really important. But I did, as a part of my work, and I did not do this really systematically, but I can tell you anecdotally that some of the outdoor industry advocacy groups I talked to pretty much said to a person that they didn't think that there were any negative effects of outdoor recreation. And so I think that we have a long way to go, and I think that part of that means trying to depoliticize this. I think that there's a concern that if we acknowledge some of these recreation impacts, that's going to give an inroads to arguments for potentially more extractive activities. And so I think that it's worth saying, we care about these resources in the same way that we cared about our forests in the late 19th century and 20th century and kind of reviewed our management practices and tried to get more sustainable, that we should be doing something akin to that. So I'm punting a little bit, John, but I think that, yeah, I'm going to punt a little bit still. I'm going to stick with that. Sarah, do you have
add
add?
something to that before we move on? And that is just to say that my primary employer is a conservation NGO, and one of my motives for going out and speaking about this topic, in particular to audiences of conservation NGOs and their supporters, is that I've observed sort of a growing number of partnerships and collaborations between conservation organizations and outdoor recreation industry and advocacy groups, which makes a ton of sense, right? Because we're concerned about making sure that we have a broad constituency for conservation and more conservationists like coming up from younger generations. And so I just think it's really important to have this potential conflict on the table as we talk about those collaborations and alliances, in the same way that it's uncomfortable for us as individuals to think about. We might not be able to do something that we really like to do because it conflicts with our value of conservation. I think we just need to be acknowledging that the potential trade-off exists and figuring out how to work around it instead of ignoring it.
I really liked what you keyed on about using the recreationals to do some of your study work. And I think that's something we could apply up here with the large tracts of land that is owned in the community here, with the recreationists here. Because as you pointed out, the land managers were having so much trouble just educating the recreationists and enforcement. And if you make them mini biologists and study, people for you, for your groups that they're studying, then I think you'll get a lot of buy-in. Because I think there is a lot of just not knowing, that happens. And I'd like, the question is, how do you I think alluded that you are involved in doing this in some other communities. I think it'd be great if we could somehow get it done here.
Yeah. I can just say that this was sort of an experiment to us. We said, we don't have the man or woman power to collect all of the information that we need in this really dispersed system. We started this piece of our work in Adirondack Park, and we said, but there's all these people that are going out to all of these places. And there had been a history of some citizen science contributions to our organization and others up there. And so we just tried it one summer, and we were overwhelmed by the response. We basically never had anyone that we approached at a boat ramp who kind of met the necessary criteria to take the equipment and participate in the study who said no to us. And we had 100% return of all the equipment that we lent out. So we've started to deploy that strategy in other places where we work on this issue, for the reason that you highlight, that kind of engaging people in the project kind of helps to get to that kind of ultimate collaborative solution at the same time as it also helps us to get the information that we need. Yes?
I work with the Pitkin County Open Space Program, and one of the constant struggles that we have is that we manage a very small percentage of the land in the watershed, and we want to have the best scientific information we can about these landscape scale effects, but the sister agencies that we have to work with at the state and federal level are often not able to fund the type of scientific research that you guys are recommending. So my question is, what can we do to see that that kind of research gets better funding at the state and federal level?
Do you want me to try one answer?
Yeah, go ahead, Alice.
So
way to ask the easy questions.
we're going to try. So as Sarah Thomas mentioned during her kind of concluding section about our recommendations, we recommend that agencies that manage for both recreation and conservation benefits adopt sort of a regional conservation planning approach to thinking about this issue, rather than trying to achieve all objectives in every place. allocate those objectives that could potentially be in conflict to one another to different sites. Now, in an ideal world, that conservation planning process would occur across jurisdictions, right? Like in collaboration between all of the organizations and agencies that manage for those two benefits and that are have kind of the same broad constituencies. And as Sarah mentioned, there are examples of places that have been successful at doing that in different ways. But on the funding question, kind of a sub-recommendation that we didn't get into in this slightly abbreviated version of our talk is we actually recommend that the entities that fund land acquisition and management require, as part of that funding process, for the organization that's applying for the funding to demonstrate that they've engaged in such a process and made that consideration. And so then those two cycles would be tied together. Now, do I have the power to make those funding entities do that? No. But I'm happy to keep telling them that I think that's what they should do.
Hey there, I was wondering in your literature review if you saw any studies focused on intensive recreation, like camping in campsites, or dispersed camping, or hot springs, or something like that, where there's a lot of people going to the same point. I noticed a lot of things were kind of linear. And if you did see studies on that, were there conclusive results, or do you have recommendations for dealing with intensive use?
So as with before, unfortunately, I have not kept each of the, I think we had 274 studies at the end, and now we have updated it to include the last year, so now there's like 325. I don't have that in my head, but I can tell you there was a relatively large body of research, especially on kind of dispersed camping and more wilderness use, that was generated by, I believe, the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute in Montana. Especially kind of peaking in the 80s and early 90s, and I'm certain that's in our database. So A, I would point you to their work, but B, I would say the paper that I was citing all the way through, written by my PhD student, is online, open access, and it includes as supplementary material a database of all of the studies that we reviewed. So you could go to that as a resource as well.
To respond a little bit to the gentleman who talked about deer aren't dumb, I've lived in the valley for a very long time and watched the construction of I-70, and there was a lot of concern about the bighorn sheep in the canyon. Now it's been completed for about as many years as I watched it being developed. My question is, animals have the ability to adapt, and in all of this you're doing, are you beginning to see some adaptations? For example, this last winter, the bighorn sheep were not only in the canyon, but they were coming down into Glenwood Springs, which is a population area, and just that could be an addition. Like you need one more thing to do, right?
Yeah.
Are you seeing that adaptation come about?
Yeah, so in the recreation context, we would typically refer to that as habituation. And that can happen for individual animals. So there's diversity in animals, just like there's diversity in people. So there are some individual animals that can tolerate more or less disturbance than others. And then it can also be true among species. So there are some species that tend to habituate more to human environments or human disturbance than others. And those tend to be the species that we see kind of in our backyards or in our parks. And so I guess I'll say two things. One is that was addressed to some degree in the review, because those would typically be studies that would occur in terms of behavioral responses or space use of animals. And those were some of the hardest ones for us to categorize as, is this positive? It might be good for the species. They might have better nutrition, for example, if they're using human areas. So those were often unclear results, and those are kind of like categorized off on their own. And the other thing I would say is, again, if you see that habituation, it doesn't mean that everything's okay at the population level. So those animals might be coming into town, but they might be reproducing at a lower rate, or their young might not be surviving as well. And so that's, again, why I say we need to be asking these questions more at the population or the community level, which, again, are the levels at which we manage species, to see those kind of more fundamental effects.
So I want to ask a question. question from Sarah Thomas. In the research you've done over the years, do you have a correlation between, or is there a correlation in the research between recreation and conservation perspective, or are recreationists truly going to vote for conservation?
It's an excellent question. Sarah and I have talked over the years about, we refer to them as assumption number 1 and assumption number 2. And assumption number 1 is that recreation and conservation are always compatible. The second assumption is that recreation creates conservation-minded individuals. We would like to think so. We know that kind of conservation groups and kind of these advocacy groups are relying on that. The literature is really mixed about whether that's true or not. There needs to be, I think, given especially if we're looking, if that's a primary strategy for conservation organizations, that needs to be a little bit better understood as well. Common sense says yes, but there have been a number of studies and they're very conflicting in terms of what their conclusions are about it.
Thanks. We have time. We'll do one more question right here.
Oh, I'm Ellie. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. Back to Dale's comment about the financing, I just wanted to put a little plug out there and let you all know that I serve on the Pitkin County Healthy Rivers and Streams Board. Pitkin County voters approved a tax, and we have a fund. We accept grants twice a year. If there are any research scientists in here, I saw there was a deficit in amphibian and fish research. So if there was anyone here that wanted to submit a proposal to our board to sort of get some kind of research like that going, we can look at those proposals twice a year.
Thank you all for, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say one thing to that, and also then back to Dale's point about the financing. I think it's a little bit, and I'd be interested whether Sarah Reed would agree, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg. I mean, we have given this talk now a number of times to scientists in a number of different forums, to managers, and it's interesting, even with the scientists, the conservation science community, it has been an uphill battle to raise this as an issue. I mean, the land managers get it, but the scientists don't seem to be getting it. Maybe the public. And so I think that there is a little bit of a question of and this is why I think Sarah's, her work and our students' work is so important, because I think that when you can start to show, okay, we don't know that much, but what we know is cause for concern, hopefully then that starts to generate a little bit more of a momentum. I mean, this just hasn't been on the radar. It's been a blind spot. And so hopefully if we can get a little more focus on it, maybe there'd be funding attached to that, but that might be a pipe dream, who knows.
Thank you all for